Flavio Rachadinha, who now, by all indications, is no longer Rachadinha but Mesadão, and maybe even a partner of Daniel Vorcaro. Because Flavio was collecting the millions from Daniel Vorcaro, which were sent to the lawyer's fund of Eduardo Bolsonaro. And now you come here bragging. Everything you're saying is just the beginning for Little Banana. Your first-time offender has fallen. And soon you'll be charged along with your brother in Daniel Vorcaro's mafia. They said they would present the movie's accounts the following week. As soon as the audio came out, revealed by Intercept Brazil, where Flavio Bolsonaro wasn't asking but demanding millions of reais from his bosom buddy Daniel Vorcaro. Then Flavio had to confess that he had actually already received over 60 million and that he still had more than 60 million left to receive. For someone who supposedly didn't even know Daniel Vorcaro, we learned he was really that mobster Daniel Vorcaro's bosom buddy from whom they were demanding millions and millions of reais. Flavio was demanding it, and it would go to Eduardo Bolsonaro's lawyer in Texas. I've always told Flavio here about Eduardo Bolsonaro. What did I tell you? We need to find out who's funding him in the United States. Living in the United States is very expensive. It's not cheap. And Eduardo Bolsonaro is currently living a life of luxury, living in a house that costs 6 million reais. He said that the house isn't his, that the house is rented. Who is paying the rent? Just the rent is 30,000 reais per month. So, there's a lot that needs to be explained, and they haven't explained anything, but the federal police are investigating. And this is just the beginning of the fall of the Bolsonaro family, who got themselves in over their heads in Daniel Vorcaro's mafia scheme, worth billions of reais. Now he wants to pretend he doesn't know anything, pretending he didn't know, acting clueless like he's unaffected. But you can be sure that he is. And his face here in this video makes his desperation very clear. And he was counting on it. He was counting on it. Dudu Bananinha was counting on the federal Supreme Court backing down. That's why he launched all those attacks. Massive tariffs, suspension of officials' visas, enforcement of the Magnitsky Law. Alexandre de Moraes, in his decision, presented videos. Videos of Eduardo Bolsonaro himself, who produced the evidence against himself. When Carmen Lucia Castor voted, she said, Eduardo Bolsonaro is a defendant who has confessed. He confessed to his crime. He did. On social media, he produced the evidence against himself. He did. And now he's trying to play the victim, acting like he's innocent, like he's being persecuted, that he's done nothing wrong. But that doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. Let's see a bit of Minister Alexandre de Moraes' statement and Flavio Dino's, and then I'll show you Flavio's statement. Because I insist on disproving Flavio Bolsonaro's statement. He lies shamelessly, just like his father. Just like father, like son. He lies too much. That's why neither the father nor the son. Bolsonaro, never again. You can write that down, and it's Lula for the 4th time. And if you want to cry, go ahead. And soon, who will be the next in the family's line of future inmates? Who do you think is next? Things are getting crazy. Ciro Nogueira is getting screwed every possible way. I'll send this to you right now. Let's watch a clip, a bit of Minister Alexandre de Moraes' speech, where he presented several pieces of evidence there at the trial. And in the case files, there are many, many pieces of evidence that were produced by Eduardo Bolsonaro himself. Look here a bit.
Here, showing that he follows the whole trial. It says, the Supreme Federal Court of Brazil is getting ready to convict me. In retaliation against President Trump, once again trying to pit the Brazilian judicial authorities against the authorities of the executive branch of the United States. That's how a political court operates. And Trump knows better than anyone how lawfare can be turned into a weapon against political opponents. President Trump, Secretary Rubio, Secretary Besset, in other words, it's the same criminal conduct that has been practiced throughout the whole year.
And in fact, Eduardo Bolsonaro keeps trying to turn the United States against Brazil. Before the trial, he made a video and said he was going to ask Trump for help. After the trial, he pretended not to know what was going on, saying he wasn't affected and didn't even know the result. So he continues with this coup obsession. But it's not just the obsession with attempting a coup against Brazil. He continues to be obsessed with money. Don't try to tell me it's a coincidence that the money from the movie went to Eduardo Bolsonaro's lawyer's fund. The largest transfer was in February of last year, exactly when Eduardo Bolsonaro decided to go to the United States. This isn't a coincidence. This is the result of a criminal scheme between the Bolsonaro family and Daniel Vorcaro, and the federal police are investigating this. And we want to know what this connection is. My impression is that the Bolsonaro family is a partner of Daniel Vorcaro's mafia. Alexandre Demas, what a feeling that da condenação do Eduardo Bolsonaro.
Bolsonaro, huh? What kind of mafia is this? It's my own family. Is a Brazilian federal deputy's job to lobby abroad against his own country? That's not listed anywhere. From the imperial constitution to the current one, it's not listed as a duty of a federal deputy. Even if he were actually in office,
right?
And not on leave, even if he were, he wouldn't be covered by immunity. So here as well, I won't waste much time on this preliminary matter. The defendant, Eduardo Bolsonaro, was a congressman on leave. He only lost his mandate on December 18th of last year, after the complaint was accepted and the summons was ordered. At no time did he change his residence. And even though he was in the United States, and look, he was in the United States, look, he was in Israel. Where in the United States? Here, we also can't confuse those who are listening to us. When the defendant is in Brazil at an unknown address, he is summoned by public notice. But he is in Brazil, obviously. But where in Brazil? He is in the United States. Where in the United States? Especially because the defendant makes a point of evading justice. I'll show the defendant's own words saying this, saying that he was evading justice. He would not return to Brazil even if he lost his mandate as a federal deputy, afraid that by returning to Brazil, he could have his passport seized by the federal Supreme Court and he wouldn't be able to evade justice again. So, there is no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that the defendant's domicile was here in Brazil, and that was his declared domicile until December 18th. He is a deputy whose mandate was revoked, absent, but still a deputy, so much so that his mandate was revoked for having more than a third of absences, so that he couldn't find a way to escape, so that he couldn't escape again in a way that would prevent him from escaping again. Disciplinary action at the federal level, escaping again. Not his position, which he is also neglecting, because he should have, on December 19th of last year, the day after being removed as a federal deputy, he should have returned to the federal police because he is a police clerk and he is defending himself to keep his position. In other words, up to today, up to the date of this trial, at no time, not even the defendant himself, anywhere, said that he changed his domicile, that his domicile is in the United States. He only said that he doesn't return to Brazil because he's afraid of answering for the crimes he committed.
Interesting, right? Eduardo Bolsonaro, according to him, according to Eduardo Bolsonaro, pay attention. He went to the United States because he was afraid his passport would be seized. Because he was being investigated and all that, and if his passport was seized, he wouldn't be able to leave Brazil. And what was his interest in going to the United States and not have his passport seized? Maybe that explains why the money went to his lawyer in the United States and why he went to the United States. It's interesting, isn't it? He produced all the evidence against himself. And then he came pretending to be a saint. And he fled from Brazil. Now, this information is important. This Chamber of Deputies is a disgrace. These Bolsonaro supporters are a disgrace. They say a good criminal is a dead criminal, but they make excuses for criminals and for lowlifes. Something to think about. Eduardo Bolsonaro went to the United States at the end of February, around the time when Daniel Vorcaro sent the largest transfer to his lawyer's fund. He went in February, at the end of February, and we only found out that he went quietly, secretly, at the beginning of March. But he went to the United States at the end of February, in the same month that Daniel Vorcaro made the largest transfer to his lawyer in Texas in the United States. And he stayed through February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, and November. He stayed 9 months in the United States as a federal deputy from Brazil without working. To think about that, he was only stripped of his seat on December 18, 2025. He went to the United States in February, and only in December, 9 months later, in December on the 18th, was he stripped of his seat by the Chamber of Deputies, not by the Ethics Council, for breach of decorum, for being a bum and not for not going to work. He was stripped of his seat for absenteeism. He spent 9 months as a federal deputy in the United States without working. What a shame for the Chamber of Deputies. And these same deputies who are now defending Eduardo Bolsonaro took a stand against ending the 6 days on, 1 day off schedule. You can't have 2 days off a week. But Eduardo Bolsonaro spent 9 months as a federal deputy in the United States without working. He was removed from office on December 18th. What a shame. But there's a catch. That was used against him. Because of it, in the conviction proceeding at the Federal Supreme Court yesterday, how was that used against him, Andrea? At the most important stage of the case. The most important act, especially in a criminal case, is valid service of process. That's when you become aware of what's happening and you are notified so you can defend yourself. Without valid service of process, the entire case is void. But the fact that Eduardo Bolsonaro remained a federal deputy for 9 months, even while he was in the United States, not working, but officially to the Chamber of Federal Deputies. And you have no shame, do you, Hugo Mota? You let Eduardo continue as a federal deputy? It was used against him to make the service by publication valid. Because if he was a federal deputy, every federal deputy has to have legal residence in Brazil. Right, Andrea? Yes, otherwise you can't be a federal deputy in Brazil. And if he was a federal deputy, he had legal residence in Brazil. And if he had legal residence in Brazil and couldn't be found, service had to be by publication. Do you understand, my dear? And why is this important? This is extremely important because this eliminates any claim that the proceedings are invalid. That they, the Bolsonaro supporters, are saying exists. He couldn't be served by public notice because he's in the United States. Where? Even though he has legal residence in Brazil and is a federal congressman from Brazil. He was a congressman, remained a congressman until December 18, 2025. Do you understand, my dear? That disproves the argument that he couldn't be served by public notice. Because for the Bolsonaro supporters and for Eduardo Bolsonaro and Flavio Bolsonaro, he had to be served by letter rogatory. What is that, Andrea? It's when the Brazilian courts send a letter to the courts in the United States. And it's the United States courts that decide whether to serve, to summon the person to respond to the case or not. And that's slow, that's bureaucratic. And many times the courts of the other country, according to their sovereignty, may decide not to serve, not to summon the person there in their territory. Meanwhile, what happens to the case? It just sits there. Was that it? Is that what Eduardo Bolsonaro wanted? That's what the Bolsonaro supporters, Flávio Bolsonaro, are lying to people about. That it had to be through a letter rogatory. But that's not the case. Because he was a federal deputy until December 18th, and every federal deputy has domicile in Brazil. And if he wasn't found at his domicile in Brazil, service is by public notice. Then all of that fell apart. So on the side, the Chamber of Deputies tried to cover up for the coup plotter and the criminal Eduardo Bolsonaro. But with this action by the chamber, they ended up harming Eduardo Bolsonaro. Because as a federal deputy of Brazil with domicile in Brazil, he could and was served by public notice. Do you understand, my dear? If they had impeached Eduardo Bolsonaro, say, a month after he went to the United States, for example, then yes, the Supreme Court would have to serve him through a letter rogatory. Because he would go to the United States, he would no longer be a federal deputy, and he would establish his domicile there in the United States. Then yes, it would be through a letter rogatory, and the case would still be stalled to this day. Just like it is, for example, with Paulo Figueiredo. Paulo Figueiredo, as you know, was convicted for the coup-related password for the coup issue to almost 9 years in prison. He has American citizenship and he is domiciled in the United States. He is not a federal deputy of Brazil like Eduardo Bolsonaro was until December 18th. So he has American citizenship and he has been domiciled in the United States for several years now, including for tax purposes. That's why Alexandre de Moraes sent the summons through a letter rogatory, which depends on the exequatur of the American justice system, which may or may not grant it. In his case, they're stalling, and his case is still on hold to this day because he was part of the core group together with Bolsonaro in the communications part of the digital militia involved in the coup attempt. Do you understand, my dear? Then they say that Eduardo Bolsonaro should have been summoned just like Paulo Figueiredo. But the actual situation is completely different. And when the Chamber of Deputies covered up for Eduardo Bolsonaro and allowed him to continue even in the United States as a federal deputy until December 18th, his domicile in Brazil ended. He had to be served by public notice since no one knew his whereabouts. Period. That's it. Any kind of procedural nullity. Now, it's obvious that they jump on that to misinform you. But here you don't stay misinformed. Here you get information as it really is. Let's take a look at the lie here, the misinformation from the liar Flavio Bolsonaro. Exactly in that context I just explained to you, where there are people who are being deceived by these lies and other people who have no commitment to the truth. because they are swindlers, liars, maybe even criminals too. But here the mask falls off. Look here.
One person, yet another great injustice committed against Eduardo Bolsonaro, in a case that is absolutely void from any angle you look at it. Because Alexandre de Moraes, he should recuse himself from hearing this case, since in theory he is the victim, therefore he is indeed a party involved.
In this oops, first lie, Alexandre de Moraes is not a party. Oh, Andrea, but the crime was coercion of the judge. And Eduardo Bolsonaro, he tried to coerce Alexandre de Moraes specifically with the threats that the Trump administration was going to send cars, F-35 fighter jets to drop bombs on Brazil. And they were going to send warships, aircraft carriers to Lake Paranoa in Brasilia over to Guanabara Bay, and that they were going to drop bombs on Brazil, and I don't know what else. The main person he threatened was Alexandre de Moraes, Andrea. So Alexandre de Moraes is indeed a victim. So if Alexandre de Moraes is a victim, he couldn't judge and convict. Oops. You can stop? You can stop with all these lies. Let me tell you something. The crime of coercion in the course of legal proceedings, it's not a crime against the judge in his personal capacity. It's a crime against the relevant government entity as a legal entity. In this case, it's a crime against public administration, against the administration of justice. It's not against the judge, because think about it. Think about it, my dear. Use your reasoning, because the Bolsonarists aren't thinking anymore. Use your reasoning. If every time a criminal goes after the judge, remove the judge for coercion during legal proceedings, because the judge becomes the victim. No criminal will be judged. Because if that were true, Flavio's lie, no one could be judged by a judge, because all you would have to do is threaten the judge. All you would have to do is coerce the judge. Then the judge would become a victim and be removed. Then you would do this to all the judges. You would never be judged. Isn't that right? That's why this crime isn't against the judge personally, not against the judge as a private individual, as a natural person. This crime is a crime against public administration, against the government entity, in this case, against the administration of justice. He insulted, he threatened, he coerced the state itself acting as judge. And not the judge personally, whoever that may be. Because I repeat, if that were the case, it would be enough for the criminal to threaten and coerce the judge. Then the judge would become a victim and would have to step aside. Then a second judge would come, and the criminal would threaten and coerce that judge too, and that judge would have to step aside. In other words, the criminal, the thug, would never be tried and convicted. And let me ask you something, I'm not sure about this. I have a serious question here. Is Flavio Bolsonaro a lawyer? Because if he's a lawyer, either he's lying and knows exactly what I'm explaining to you, and he's lying to sweet talk the crowd, or he's a really lousy lawyer who hasn't studied anything at all and knows absolutely nothing about criminal law or criminal procedure. And he should know, because the case he's talking about here is his brother's. And as far as I know, he's a lawyer. Is Flavio Bolsonaro really a lawyer, folks? Did he graduate or buy his law license? How is that possible, for God's sake? Do you know what this is? It's scumbag behavior. It's trickery. He knows what I'm explaining to you. But they work with misinformation, manipulating the gullible crowd who still believe in trickery. Do you understand? In trickery, brazenness, in being shameless. And I feel such a strong repulsion, such a huge repulsion for people who know the law but manipulate and lie to deceive others and herd them like cattle. That's what he's doing, Flavio Bolsonaro. That's what Eduardo is doing. That's what Nicolas Ferreira is doing. That's what Sostens Cavalcante is doing. That's what Van Hattem is doing. That's what all the Bolsonarist deputies and senators are doing with this lie right here. That's a lie. And they know that very well. It's just that they have no commitment to the truth. Their commitment is to manipulating the masses. Don't let yourself be manipulated like cattle. Here, only those who want to be manipulated are manipulated here. Because if you have the slightest commitment to the truth, you will never believe these people's lies. That's why I share the live stream, because it's very important, but he didn't stop lying. Flavio lies even more. The liar dies just like his father. It's a shame. That causes me great indignation. You'll have to excuse me. Great indignation. Because you can have different political views, and that's okay. Political pluralism is part of our democracy. In fact, it's part of any democracy. Political pluralism, being right-wing, left-wing, or centrist, is part of the democratic process. Political pluralism is actually one of the foundations of our federative republic here in Brazil, according to the Constitution. It's all good. But you spreading lies and misinformation to support criminals and crooks, you need to reconsider your positions, especially because we know that in the Christian faith, the father of lies is the devil. And those who lie without remorse are children of the devil. It's written there in the Bible. It's not me who's saying it, no. It's written there in the Bible. And I'm explaining to you that he's lying. And if you repeat and spread his lie, be careful. Hell is right over there. I'm speaking in biblical language, right? Because you understand that language sometimes. And I know that language too. Even more than a lot of people, actually. But he keeps on lying. And who is the father of lies? Just to emphasize, the devil. Keeps on lying.
He is disqualified from judging the case because it's public knowledge, and it became a personal issue against Eduardo Bolsonaro, right? It clearly seems like revenge against Eduardo. Eduardo wasn't even formally summoned, which is a basic legal requirement. He has a known address. They should use a letter rogatory to summon him through legal procedure.
Another lie that I won't explain again because I just explained it to you. He was summoned by public notice because he has a residence in Brazil and they didn't know where he was. Why did he have a residence in Brazil? Because he is a federal congressman from Brazil, and believe it or not, he remained through March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, and December. He stayed after he went to the United States in February. He stayed all those months until December 18th as a federal congressman from Brazil. He was only removed for absence on December 18th, 2025. And if he is a federal congressman from Brazil, every federal congressman from Brazil is required to have domicile in Brazil. And if the person has domicile in Brazil and is in an unknown and unspecified location, they must be summoned by public notice. I'm going to ask again, is he a lawyer, guys? Because he doesn't seem to be a lawyer. Doesn't he know that? Or does he know and is trying to manipulate people with lies and misinformation? What do you think? Or is he just pretending to be innocent, acting in good faith as a lawyer who doesn't know anything and is repeating a lie he doesn't know about? Or is he a sly scammer who's saying this just to deceive people? What do you think?
To become aware of the case, you can't say he knew what was happening just from his live stream comments. He only got information from the media, so we can't know if it was true. It's just journalism, right? So claiming that he didn't.
No, that's another lie. He didn't find out through the media. He gave interviews and informed the media. He did live streams, Eduardo Bolsonaro, and announced like, I'm being prosecuted by the Federal Supreme Court for the crime of coercion in the course of proceedings. I don't know what. He was fully aware. And he himself, as Carmen Lucia said, is a defendant who has confessed. He produced evidence against himself. And the fact that the Chamber of Deputies covered for him and only revoked his mandate after almost 10 months outside Brazil on December 18th was used against him. Because if he remained a federal deputy, he has domicile in Brazil, unknown whereabouts, valid service by public notice, period. End of discussion. So there is no procedural nullity at all. None. That's why he was unanimously convicted by the first panel of the Supreme Federal Court. It's very important, and I know I'm being a bit redundant sometimes, but it's because you need to know this. Brazil needs to know this because the Bolsonaro supporters are spreading lies on social media. Flavio Bolsonaro himself, Eduardo Bolsonaro, and all the other Bolsonaro supporters, and I just look at it like this. The guy isn't even ashamed to say he's a lawyer. With a scam like this, is just unbelievable. Flavio Dino, I'll highlight a part of his speech where he says that the Supreme Federal Court, the highest court in Brazil, might be the most attacked in the world. Exactly why, Andrea, because the white-collar criminals... I remembered the song, but I'm not going to say right what the song says. White-collar criminals are going to jail because the Supreme Court is sending them. I'm not claiming the Supreme Court is perfect. But in Brazil, especially by the far right, it's very easy to criminalize the poor and black people. The hard part is putting white-collar criminals in jail. And the Supreme Court is putting a lot of white-collar criminals in jail, including a former president like Bolsonaro. And as a result, this scummy criminal far right is attacking the Supreme Court in every possible way. But the message has been sent. We will not back down. We are not afraid. That was the message sent yesterday by the Federal Supreme Court. Let's watch the clip of Justice Flavio Dino's speech. Already done, like the live stream if you haven't yet, and share it. It's very important. People need to know this information. Pay attention.
And then, as already pointed out, there is indeed an attempt to discredit the judiciary in order to weaken it. And this is a technique that is part of the collection. Enough to express the intensity, the repetition of the aggressiveness that your Supreme Court faces, as happens in constitutional defects, and it needs to be overcome. A defendant that contains, in addition to constitutional flaws, these incidents in criminal offenses. At the same time, as we all remember, our condition as judges imposes a series of restrictions, among which is this one, of responding to this public debate, which reinforces the need for institutional protections, aiming to ensure the independence of the judiciary.
Exactly that. The judiciary will remain independent and will do what needs to be done. At least that's what Brazilian society expects, that criminals go to jail, especially traitors to the country. Regarding this situation, we still haven't actually seen these traitors, along with Daniel Vorcaro's mafia, go to jail. No, I know a lot of people are already in jail. Daniel Vorcaro, his father, anyway, Fabiano, Zeitel, but they are still in preventive detention. The evidentiary record still has to be built. Then the charges have to be filed and accepted. The criminal case has to begin, and the appropriate convictions can be handed down. And all of this needs, in time and space, a time frame that is natural to the justice system, so that injustices are not committed, right? Alexandre de Moraes also highlighted in his ruling that Eduardo Bolsonaro, in an attempt to get away, put all of Brazil in jeopardy. He brought harm to all of Brazil. It's really important that you like the live stream, leave your comment and share it, okay? Here, look, this is the WhatsApp group. It's the WhatsApp channel where I send notifications to you. Whenever there's something new, I send it in this group so you don't miss anything. There are a lot of people who can't do it and don't get notified. So join here and you'll find out about things much faster, okay? And take a look at the first comment that I'm going to post now. There is important information and also the link for you to join the WhatsApp channel. You just need to have WhatsApp, nothing else. Yeah, it's in the first comment. Everything will be in the first comment because there are people here saying they can't even find where to share. That's why I always put it in the first comment. And don't forget, I'll answer the most important questions at 8 p.m. on the Andrea Gonçalves No Art channel. And the link is also in the first comment, okay? Bye-bye. First comment, all right? Kisses.